In the wild, untamed hills of Montana, a farmer's daughter named Ellie Hayes has grown up in isolation, far from the chaos of the world. But when a gang of ruthless thugs targets her farm, unaware of her incredible skill with a gun, Ellie must use everything she's learned to defend her land and her life. As tensions build, the small, quiet farm becomes a battlefield, and Ellie will have to confront her enemies in a final, deadly showdown that will define her future. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The day had begun like any other for Ellie Hayes. The sun rose early over the rugged hills of Montana, casting long shadows over the fields and farms that dotted the valley. Ellie stood by the barn, her hands calloused from years of work as she fed the horses and checked the fences. It had been a hard winter, but now, with spring settling in, the farm was alive with the promise of new crops and a good harvest. Ellie had always lived a simple life. Just her and her father, working the land, making the most of what they had. The Hayes farm had been passed down from her grandfather, and Ellie had learned to handle everything from planting crops to caring for livestock. Her father, a man of few words, had always taught her how to be self-sufficient, how to protect herself in a world where danger was never far away. But Ellie wasn't just any farmer's daughter. Underneath her quiet exterior and the dust that covered her worn boots, Ellie Hayes was a prodigy, a gunfighter, trained since she was a young girl to use a pistol with the precision of a marksman. Her father had taught her not only how to survive, but how to fight for what was hers. In the rough world of the American frontier, that skill would soon be tested. As Ellie went about her chores, she had no idea that her life was about to change. In the distance, the sound of hooves grew louder, growing closer with every passing moment. At first, Ellie didn't think much of it, just another traveler passing through the valley. But as the dust rose in the air, she felt a prickling on the back of her neck. Something was off. The three men on horseback appeared on the rise just as Ellie was finishing up with the horses. They came down the dirt road with purpose, and Ellie could see the glint of their rifles as they drew closer. Her heart skipped a beat. These weren't travelers. These were men with ill intentions. Ellie quickly glanced around the barn, looking for cover, but there was no time. The men stopped in front of her farmhouse, blocking the road. Their horses snorted, stamping their hooves in the dust, and the leader of the group, a large man with a scar across his cheek, dismounted first. Well, what do we have here?" the leader called out, a sneer twisting his face. His eyes raked over Ellie, a cold, predatory look in his gaze. A lonely farm, and a pretty little thing all alone to keep it running. Ellie didn't flinch, but her hand instinctively moved to her waist, where the revolver her father had given her as a child was holstered. She had learned early that the best way to handle trouble was to face it head-on. "I don't want any trouble," Ellie said, her voice steady, but her fingers were tight on the grip of her pistol. "You best be on your way." The man chuckled darkly, his rough laughter echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. "Trouble? Oh, sweetheart, you don't have any say in the matter. We're just here to take what we want." He gestured to the other two men, who dismounted as well, their eyes already scanning the farm as if deciding where to begin their raid. One of the men, a smaller fellow with a thin mustache, stepped forward with a grin that made Ellie's skin crawl. "I think we'll start with the livestock," he said, licking his lips. "Ain't nothing like fresh meat." Ellie's heart was racing now, but she kept her face impassive. She had seen enough of men like this to know they weren't interested in negotiating. They were out for themselves, and if she didn't stand her ground, they would take everything. "You don't want to do this," Ellie warned, her voice cold and clear. "I don't mind defending myself." The leader's grin widened, and he stepped closer to her, the sound of his boots crunching in the dirt. "Defend yourself, huh?" He looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed. "You look like you're a bit out of your element, little lady. Think you can take us all on?" Ellie's fingers brushed against the cold steel of her revolver as she met his gaze. There was no hesitation in her heart. She had been trained for this moment, even if she hadn't expected it to come so soon. She wasn't afraid of these men. Not when she had the skills to defend herself. "I can handle myself just fine," she said, taking a step back toward the barn. Her eyes were locked on the leader, but her body was already calculating the distance, the angle of the sun, the number of men. Everything she needed to make her move. The leader took another step forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Is that so? Well, I'm sure we can make this interesting then." Before Ellie could react, the man lunged toward her, his hand reaching for the gun at his side. But Ellie was faster. In a fluid motion, she drew her own revolver, aiming it at the man's chest. The sound of the shot echoed through the valley, sharp and clear. The leader staggered back, his hand instinctively clutching his chest where the bullet had hit him. For a moment, there was stunned silence. The two other men froze, eyes wide with disbelief. Ellie stood there, her pistol still raised, her fingers steady on the trigger, her body poised to react if they tried anything. The leader gasped, his face twisted in shock. You shot me," he snarled, his voice filled with venom. "You're going to pay for that, you little—" Before he could finish his sentence, Ellie's second shot rang out, this time hitting the man in the leg, sending him crashing to the ground with a howl of pain. The two other men immediately reached for their own pistols, but Ellie was already 2 steps ahead. The first thug, the one with the mustache, barely had time to draw his gun before Ellie fired again, sending him stumbling backward with a bullet lodged in his shoulder. The second man hesitated for just a moment longer, giving Ellie the opening she needed. With one final shot, the man fell to the ground, his gun slipping from his hand. Silence. Ellie stood, breathing heavily, her gun still drawn, watching the men writhe in the dust. The leader groaned from where he lay, clutching his bleeding chest. Ellie's expression was cold. "I warned you," she said simply, her voice low but steady. The dust from the gunfire still hung in the air like a cloud, thick and heavy, as Ellie stood over the 3 men. Her heart raced, adrenaline pumping through her veins, but her hands were steady. She had done what needed to be done, and there was no time for hesitation. The thugs had underestimated her, just as many had in the past, but now they would understand that she wasn't a victim to be taken lightly. The leader, still gasping for breath, managed to prop himself up on one elbow. His eyes locked onto Ellie with a mixture of disbelief and rage. Blood soaked through his shirt, staining the dirt beneath him. You'll regret this," he spat, his voice weak but venomous. "We'll be back for you. All of us. This farm won't stand long after we're done." Ellie didn't flinch. She simply lowered her gun, her cold gaze fixed on him. "You won't get the chance. You've made a mistake. I don't take threats kindly." The man tried to lift his gun, but Ellie was already ahead of him. She fired one more shot, aimed carefully at his hand, disarming him before he could do anything more. He screamed in pain, clutching his bleeding wrist, and collapsed back to the ground. She took a step forward, her boots crunching on the dirt, and stood above him. "You're lucky you're still breathing. Now, get up." The leader's eyes flashed with defiance, but he didn't move. Ellie could see the calculation behind his eyes, the fear that was beginning to take root. His men were incapacitated, and he was bleeding out fast. "You'll never hold this land," he muttered through gritted teeth. "We'll come back. We always come back." Ellie didn't respond immediately. Her mind was already moving ahead, thinking of the consequences of what she had just done. She had protected herself and her farm, but she knew this wouldn't be the last time men like this would try to take what was hers. The frontier was filled with dangerous men, and the world had no sympathy for women who fought back. She turned and walked away, her boots kicking up dust as she moved toward the barn. Her father, who had been inside watching the whole exchange, stepped out, his weathered face showing nothing but concern. "I heard the shots," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "What happened?" Ellie didn't look at him at first. She could still feel the weight of the moment, the tension in her chest. "They came for the livestock, Pa," she said simply, her voice calmer now. "They didn't expect me to fight back." Her father's eyes narrowed, and he glanced over her shoulder at the 3 men, 2 of whom were still struggling in the dirt. His gaze flickered to the bloodstains, to the weapons discarded on the ground, and back to Ellie. "You're sure you're all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. I'm fine, Ellie said, her tone sharp but not unkind. But we need to get them off the property. I won't leave them here to come back at night. Her father nodded slowly. He had always been a quiet man, a man of few words, but Ellie knew he was proud of her. He might not have shown it outwardly, but he knew better than anyone that she was capable of taking care of herself. Without another word, they both moved toward the men. Ellie approached the leader, who was now cradling his wrist and cursing under his breath. His eyes were full of hate, but there was something else in them too. Fear. Fear of what Ellie had just done. I said, "Get up," Ellie repeated, her voice cold. The man gritted his teeth but obeyed, slowly pushing himself off the ground. His movements were slow, almost reluctant, and Ellie could see the pain in his eyes. "Where are the rest of your gang?" Ellie demanded. "If you're here to raid my farm, I want to know how many of you are still out there." The leader sneered, though his expression was pained. "You think I'm going to give you anything?" he spat. "You think I'm just going to tell you everything?" Ellie didn't flinch. Her grip on her pistol tightened, and she took a step closer. "You'll tell me what I want to know, or I'll make sure you never leave this farm." The leader's eyes flickered with fear for a moment before he seemed to resign himself to the reality of the situation. "We've got a camp to the east," he muttered, his voice strained. "About 2 miles away. We were supposed to raid your livestock, take whatever we could, then head back. But you've made things complicated." Ellie nodded. "Good. Now get moving." She and her father watched as the leader staggered toward his horse, his 2 injured companions following with grimaces. The leader's eyes were still full of malice, but there was nothing he could do. He had underestimated Ellie, and now he and his men would face the consequences. As they watched the men retreat, Ellie's father sighed, his expression unreadable. "They won't stop, Ellie. Not after what you did to them." "I know," she said quietly, her gaze still on the men. "But they'll have to learn that not everyone's easy prey." Her father didn't reply. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed it once. Ellie knew he was proud of her. He always had been, but he also knew the weight of what had just happened. This was only the beginning. They watched as the men disappeared into the distance. Then Ellie turned to her father. "We need to prepare," she said, her voice steady, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "They won't give up this easily. We need to be ready for them when they come back." Her father nodded, the reality of their situation settling over them both. The fight wasn't over, and in this wild, unforgiving land, survival meant always being ready for the next fight. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Ellie and her father moved back toward the farmhouse, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were far from safe. But one thing was certain: if those men returned, they wouldn't be getting any easy victories from Ellie Hayes. The air had grown colder as the evening settled in, a biting wind sweeping down from the mountains. Ellie stood by the barn, her arms crossed, her gaze locked on the distant horizon where the men had disappeared. The darkness of night was creeping over the land, and Ellie couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her insides. She could still feel the tension in her muscles, the remnants of the fight that had just taken place. It hadn't been a victory, not really, not when she knew it wasn't over yet. Her father, now back in the barn, was tending to the horses. His old bones creaked as he moved, but his movements were deliberate, careful. She knew he wasn't just preparing the animals for the night. He was preparing for the next fight. They both knew it was coming. "Pa, we need to talk," Ellie said, her voice low but firm as she stepped toward him. He looked up at her, his weathered face unreadable. "I know," he replied. His voice was as steady as always, but his eyes betrayed the worry he didn't always show. "We need to secure the farm. We can't afford to let our guard down." Ellie nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her revolver. "We'll need to move quickly. They're gonna come back with more men. I can feel it." Her father sighed, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "I don't like this, Ellie. I don't like the idea of you fighting like this. I've seen enough violence in my life to last 100 lifetimes. But if you're determined," he stopped, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll stand by you, but we have to make sure they don't overrun us." Ellie gave him a soft, understanding smile. She knew he'd never wanted this for her. Not the life of a fighter, not the life of constant danger, but he had trained her, had shown her how to survive in a world where men like the ones who had come to her farm were a dime a dozen. If there was one thing Ellie knew, it was that this world wasn't kind, especially to people who didn't fight back. "We'll be all right, Pa," she said, her voice steady. "We've got the land. We've got each other." Her father met her gaze, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The reality of their situation settled over them like a dark cloud. The night was growing colder, and the silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. But Ellie knew there was no turning back now. Suddenly, the sound of hooves reached their ears, distant at first, but growing louder. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. It was happening sooner than she had expected. She and her father exchanged a quick glance, their previous conversation forgotten in the blink of an eye. They moved quickly, preparing for the worst. Ellie drew her revolver, checking the chamber to make sure it was loaded. Her father grabbed the rifle from the corner of the barn, his grip tight as he steadied himself. The thugs hadn't waited long. They were on their way back, just as Ellie had predicted. They hadn't forgotten, and they weren't about to leave her farm in peace. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer. Ellie took her place beside the barn door, peeking through the crack between the wooden slats. The moon was barely visible, hidden behind clouds, but the outline of the riders was clear in the dim light. There were more than she had expected. At least 5, maybe 6 men, coming down the road with purpose. Their faces were hard, determined, and Ellie could see their weapons clearly. These weren't just random thugs. These were men who had been on the move, who had been preparing for something bigger. Her father moved up behind her, his voice low but filled with urgency. "They're not going to be satisfied with a warning, Ellie. They'll be looking to finish what they started." Ellie nodded, her jaw clenched. She had expected this, and now that it was here, she could feel her pulse steady as she took in the situation. The men weren't in a hurry. They thought they had the upper hand, that they could walk onto her land and take whatever they wanted. But Ellie wasn't going to let that happen. "We need to draw them in," she said quietly, her eyes narrowing. "Let them get closer." Her father nodded, shifting his weight to his back foot. He knew what she meant. They would draw the men in close enough to strike, use the cover of the barn and the darkness to their advantage. The first shots would be critical. It was the only way they would stand a chance. Ellie turned to face her father, her eyes hard with determination. "When they're close enough, we take the first shot. No hesitation." Her father's expression softened, a trace of pride in his eyes, but there was still that underlying concern. He had never liked this, never liked the idea of his daughter in the middle of gunfights. But she was ready. Ellie always had been. As the riders got closer, Ellie's breath slowed, her focus narrowing. She could hear their voices now, rough and coarse as they spoke to one another, unaware of the trap being set for them. "All we gotta do is take what's ours and leave," one of them said, his voice laced with arrogance. Ellie's fingers tightened on her revolver, her eyes fixed on the group. They were close enough now. Her father had taken his position by the window, rifle raised. He didn't need to be told what to do. Ellie knew he'd be ready when the time came. "Now," Ellie whispered. The first shot rang out, the sound sharp and clear in the still night air. It came from her father, who had taken the first shot, hitting the lead rider square in the chest. The man fell off his horse with a cry of shock, tumbling into the dirt. Chaos erupted immediately. The other riders pulled their guns, trying to return fire, but Ellie was faster. She fired twice in quick succession, hitting 2 of the men as they scrambled to draw their weapons. The remaining riders hesitated, caught off guard by the quick, precise shots. Ellie's father fired again, taking down another rider who had tried to flank them. The outlaws were scattered now, unsure of where the shots were coming from. They were disoriented, panicked, but they weren't done. They would regroup, and they would come back. Ellie stepped into the open, moving with calculated speed as she lined up her next shot. There was no room for mercy. Not with men like these. The adrenaline still surged through Ellie's veins, her mind sharp as she surveyed the chaos unfolding before her. The first few shots had been clean, the outlaws caught off guard, but Ellie knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The remaining men scrambled for cover, pulling their horses into the nearby trees, and behind the wagons scattered around the farm. They had underestimated Ellie and her father, but now they would learn that underestimating the Hayes family would be their downfall. Ellie stood tall, her revolver still in hand, as she listened intently to the sound of shifting hooves and muffled voices in the distance. The men were regrouping, trying to take control of the situation, but they were disoriented. Ellie could see it in their eyes, fear. They hadn't expected a woman, alone on a farm, to fight back. They thought they could intimidate her, rob her blind, and leave without consequence. She wasn't going to let that happen. Her father was still firing from the safety of the barn window, each shot ringing out like thunder, sending the remaining riders into a state of confusion. Ellie could hear one of them yelling for the others to fall back, but the leader, the man who had been shot earlier, was trying to rally his crew. His voice was hoarse, filled with rage. "Get back on your horses, you fools," he shouted. His words slurred from pain. "We can't let them get away with this." Ellie took a deep breath and crouched lower, her finger tightening around the grip of her revolver. This was the moment they would either win or lose. There was no turning back. She turned to her father, who had been reloading his rifle. Their eyes met for a brief second. There was no need for words. They knew what needed to be done. They had fought together before, and they would do so again. The difference this time was that they had a chance to end it now. They couldn't let the outlaws regroup again. They couldn't risk them coming back in the morning with a stronger force. Ellie motioned to her father, signaling him to cover the north side of the farm. She'd take the south. The two of them had worked this plan out before. Small, quick movements, using the terrain to their advantage. They knew the land better than anyone, and it was time to use that to their advantage. She crept toward the edge of the barn, careful not to make a sound. The men were still in the trees, but they were moving sluggishly now, each step more hesitant than the last. They hadn't counted on Ellie's marksmanship, and it was starting to show. They were disorganized, distracted by the heavy gunfire coming from every direction. Ellie didn't wait for them to make the next move. She moved fast, slipping through the barn door with a quick, silent motion. Her pulse quickened as she surveyed the area in front of her, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. A shape shifted in the distance. One of the outlaws had made a break for the barn, trying to flank her. She raised her revolver, took a deep breath, and fired. The man cried out as the bullet struck his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward, his gun falling from his hand. He tried to crawl toward cover, but Ellie was already moving, her feet light and quick as she closed the distance between them. The outlaw looked up at her, his face twisted in pain, his eyes wide with terror. You shot me," he gasped, his breath ragged. "You're just a girl." Ellie's lips tightened, and without a word, she stepped over him. Her revolver raised, aimed directly at his chest. He didn't have the chance to speak again. One shot, and the man fell silent, his body slumping into the dirt. She didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. There was no time for hesitation in this world. Turning back to the barn, Ellie scanned the surrounding area. Her father had moved to the other side, his rifle raised as he carefully aimed at a group of riders who had emerged from behind the trees. She heard his shot before she saw the rider drop to the ground, his horse rearing in panic. The remaining outlaws hesitated, trying to regroup, but they were starting to realize they were outmatched. Ellie wasn't going to give them the chance to retreat. She moved swiftly, taking cover behind the stack of hay, and lined up her next shot. The leader of the gang, the man who had survived the initial attack, was still trying to rally the others. His movements were uncoordinated now, desperate, and his eyes flashed with anger as he barked orders at his men. But Ellie had already decided. She wasn't going to let him live to fight another day. She aimed carefully, her breath slow and steady, and fired. The bullet struck the leader in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground with a grunt. His body hit the dirt, his rifle clattering beside him, and for a moment, the entire field seemed to freeze. The other outlaws, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Fear began to spread among them like wildfire, and Ellie knew this was her chance. Her father fired again, taking down another rider. The remaining men started to scatter, their previous confidence shattered by the overwhelming firepower and precision of Ellie and her father. But there was one man left, the small, wiry outlaw who had been part of the original group. He had been hanging back, watching his comrades fall, waiting for the right moment to act. But it was too late. Ellie had already anticipated his move. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on his, and raised her revolver. The outlaw raised his hands in surrender, his voice trembling as he begged for his life. "I didn't sign up for this," he said quickly, his eyes darting between Ellie and her father. "Please, don't shoot. I'll leave. I won't come back. I swear." Ellie hesitated for a brief moment, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He had made his choice when he joined this gang, and now, that choice had led him here, backed into a corner by a woman who was ready to protect her farm at all costs. "You should have thought about that before you decided to ride in here," Ellie said coldly. "You've taken enough from this land already." Without another word, she fired. The outlaw fell with a soft thud, his body crumpling to the earth in the stillness of the night. Ellie stood over him for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand still clutching the revolver. The farm was quiet again, the tension slowly fading from the air. But it wasn't over. It never was. As Ellie moved back toward the barn, her father walked up beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You did well, Ellie," he said softly. She nodded, her eyes scanning the field, the silence still heavy around them. "It's not over yet. We have to stay ready. They'll be back, and next time, we won't get so lucky." Her father didn't argue. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. And as the night fell fully over the farm, Ellie Hayes realized that the land she had fought so hard to protect would be tested again. But this time, she would be ready. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the farm. The quiet after the battle was suffocating, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Ellie stood by the barn, her fingers still tight around the grip of her revolver, though she had lowered it for the moment. The adrenaline that had fueled her during the fight was starting to wear off, leaving her with the cold weight of reality. Her father had gone inside to rest. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but Ellie knew he wouldn't sleep for long. Neither of them would. They had faced danger before, but tonight had been different. The outlaws were more organized, more determined. This was no random raid. These men had a purpose, and Ellie knew that meant trouble. As the night deepened, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lingering, watching. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves in the trees, and Ellie's eyes darted to the distant horizon. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. "They won't stop, Ellie. Not after what you did to them." She knew he was right. The men who had come to her farm were just pawns in a bigger game. They were part of something larger. Ellie didn't know who was pulling the strings, but she was certain that this wasn't the last time she would face them. The night had settled into a strange quiet, but Ellie could feel the storm brewing, just beyond the edges of the valley. Suddenly, the sound of hooves reached her ears. Her heart skipped a beat. They were back. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly moved toward the barn, slipping into the shadows, her body instinctively tensing. She listened carefully as the hoofbeats grew louder, closer, and she cursed under her breath. The outlaws hadn't been satisfied with just one attack. They had returned with reinforcements. Her mind raced, calculating the number of riders, the distance between them and the barn. It would be close, but she had no choice. She had to act. Quietly, she moved toward the edge of the barn, keeping low to the ground. Through the narrow gaps between the wooden planks, she could see them. At least 5 riders, possibly more, coming up the trail. They weren't moving at a full gallop, but their presence was ominous. The same leader, the one she had shot in the leg, was still among them, though his wounds had clearly slowed him down. The other riders were armed and alert, their faces shadowed by their hats, their eyes scanning the land for any sign of movement. Ellie's pulse quickened, but she remained perfectly still. She knew she couldn't take them all on at once, especially with her father resting inside. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. There was no question that they were here for more than just the livestock. They had been here before, and now they were back for revenge. The leader's voice broke through the silence. "Spread out. We're not leaving until we find them." Ellie's teeth clenched, but she didn't move. She had to wait. She had to be patient. As the men dismounted, Ellie crept closer, moving silently through the shadows. She could hear them talking among themselves, their voices low but filled with anger and frustration. They had no idea she was watching them, no idea that she was preparing to make her move. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She positioned herself behind a stack of hay bales, her heart pounding in her chest. The men were getting closer now, their steps heavy on the earth as they circled the barn. They were looking for her, looking for any sign that she was hiding. "I don't see anyone," one of the men called out, his voice full of annoyance. "Where the hell is she? We know she's here." Ellie's hand tightened around her revolver as she inched closer, her body tensed, ready to strike. She couldn't wait much longer. If they found her, it would be over. But if she acted now, she might have a chance. The leader's voice called out again, his tone more forceful. "She's here. I know it. She killed my men. Now we finish what we started." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. There was no more time for hesitation. With a swift movement, she drew her revolver, stepping out from behind the haystack. The first shot rang out, hitting one of the men square in the chest. He didn't even have time to scream before he crumpled to the ground, his body jerking with the impact of the bullet. The others froze, stunned by the sudden attack. The element of surprise was hers, and she was going to make it count. "Get down!" the leader barked, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. He dove for cover, pulling his own revolver as he scrambled for safety. Ellie didn't waste a second. She fired again, taking out another rider who had tried to run toward the horses. He fell with a howl, his body hitting the dirt with a sickening thud. Ellie's heart pounded, but her aim was steady. This was what she had trained for. But there were still too many. The leader and the remaining riders returned fire, their bullets missing by mere inches as Ellie ducked behind cover. The night was filled with the sharp crack of gunshots, the sound of metal striking wood, the heavy rhythm of hooves moving frantically across the ground. Ellie's mind raced. She couldn't keep this up forever. She needed to make her move before the men regrouped and overwhelmed her. She glanced over her shoulder at the barn. Her father was still inside, but she couldn't afford to wait for him to recover. She had to finish this now. With a deep breath, Ellie sprinted across the barnyard, her revolver raised. She fired once more, hitting one of the men who had been trying to flank her from the side. He fell without a sound, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. Ellie's pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, but she couldn't stop. She was too close now. The leader, his face twisted with rage, emerged from behind a barrel, his gun aimed directly at her. Ellie saw the flash of his eyes, the anger burning in them, and knew he was going to take the shot. But Ellie was faster. She squeezed the trigger, her shot hitting him in the shoulder, sending him staggering back in pain. He collapsed to the ground with a grunt, his gun slipping from his hand. The remaining rider, seeing his leader fall, hesitated, his fear now outweighing his desire for revenge. Ellie approached him slowly, her revolver still raised, her finger lightly on the trigger. The man didn't move, his body trembling from the fear that had finally overtaken him. "You don't have to do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We just wanted the cattle. Just leave us be and we'll go." Ellie's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward. "It's too late for that," she said coldly. "You came here for more than that. And now, you'll leave with nothing." Without another word, she fired. The man dropped to the ground, his body still. The farm was quiet again. Ellie stood amidst the bodies of the men who had come to her land, their weapons scattered across the dirt. She took a slow breath, her heart still racing from the fight. The night air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, and her hands shook with the aftermath of the fight. But there was no time to relax. She knew they would return. There would always be more like them. Ellie Hayes had fought to protect her farm tonight, but she knew this battle was just one in a long war for survival, and she was ready for whatever came next. The night felt like it stretched on forever. Ellie stood in the middle of the barnyard, the wind biting at her skin, her gun still heavy in her hand, but her body numb from the intensity of the fight. The bodies of the outlaws, sprawled across the dirt, were a grim reminder that the world outside the safety of her home was far from kind. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, like a ghost that wouldn't leave. She stepped cautiously around the fallen bodies, her boots making a soft crunch on the earth as she moved. The moon was barely visible now, swallowed by clouds, leaving the valley in near darkness. Ellie's eyes scanned the area, alert, though her body was exhausted from the rush of the fight. Her chest still heaved from the exertion, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not yet. The sound of horses still echoed faintly in her mind, and the distant howls of coyotes filled the silence. She could hear the rustling of the trees, the low moan of the wind, but her ears were attuned to something far more urgent: the sound of footsteps, the crack of a twig, the soft hum of tension in the night. Her father had been inside, but Ellie knew better than to leave him unguarded. She checked back over her shoulder toward the barn. The door was slightly ajar, the dim light spilling from within. Her father hadn't moved much since the fight, his old bones worn down by age and the constant toil of living on the frontier. Ellie knew her father was trying to get some rest. He'd never been one for idle chatter, but tonight, she could feel the weight of his concerns. After the shooting stopped, he hadn't said much, just words of approval, quiet praise, and more silence. He wasn't used to seeing his daughter stand alone in a gunfight. Not like this. She took another slow breath and moved toward the barn, her senses heightened, every shadow in the night seeming to hide something just out of view. Her boots scuffed the dirt again, and she adjusted her grip on her revolver as she approached the door. "Pa," she called softly, keeping her voice low. Her father appeared in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the faint light inside. He didn't speak right away, his eyes scanning the dark valley around them as if expecting something else to come charging through the night. "Thought you could use a rest," Ellie continued, stepping inside. Her father didn't respond at first. He was examining the rifles and the ammunition, making sure everything was still intact. Finally, he lowered his gaze to Ellie and let out a sigh. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice steady but tired. "But I don't know how much longer that's going to last." Ellie didn't respond immediately, instead moving over to the small table by the window, where her father had started to clean his rifle. The weapons were a constant reminder of their dangerous life. "What's next?" she asked after a moment, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Her father leaned against the wall, folding his arms over his chest. His eyes, tired and worn, met hers with a weariness that only years of life on the frontier could bring. "We wait," he said simply. "We keep the farm secure, keep our heads down. But I'm telling you, Ellie, we can't afford another fight like tonight. It's too close." Ellie glanced over at the rifles and nodded. She had lived through enough of these moments to know that her father was right. The world didn't wait for you to get comfortable, and it didn't care if you were ready. Every attack, every raid on their land, was a gamble. One that, sooner or later, they wouldn't survive. She reached for her coat, slipping it over her shoulders. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm. "I wasn't asking you to," her father replied, though there was an edge to his words now. A father's edge. Ellie stepped toward the door again, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the entire situation pressing down on her. Her father had always tried to shield her from the dangers that came with their life. He trained her, taught her, but he'd never wanted her to be on the front lines. But this wasn't about what he wanted anymore. This was about survival. "They won't stop, Pa," she said, the weight of her words hanging between them. "I know," he said, his voice low, "but we've survived this long. I'll keep us alive as long as I can." Ellie nodded, the reality of their situation settling in again. But she wasn't the kind of person to sit idle. She had been trained to fight and to win. The two of them sat in the barn, the hours stretching on, but no one came. The night dragged on, and the quiet stillness of the farm seemed almost too peaceful. But Ellie knew better. She had lived long enough on the edge of the frontier to know that peace didn't last. And soon, the sound of hooves would return, bringing with it another storm they would have to weather. As the night grew deeper, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something was waiting. She had faced danger before, but there was a chill in the air tonight that made her skin prickle with unease. They had done well to protect the farm this time, but she could feel that it wasn't enough. She wasn't just protecting her home anymore. She was protecting everything she had fought for, and every fight only made her more determined to keep it. But Ellie wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. The rest of the night passed in silence. Ellie stayed alert, keeping watch, knowing that the next wave could be just around the corner. Her father slept lightly in the corner of the barn, his mind no doubt filled with the same thoughts as hers. Every creak of the barn, every gust of wind, felt like the world breathing down on them. The hours passed slowly. Ellie knew that sooner or later, they'd have to make a move. But for now, they waited. And as the first light of morning began to filter through the cracks in the barn door, Ellie knew that the fight was far from over. It was only just beginning. The first light of morning trickled through the cracks in the barn, casting long, slender shadows on the dirt floor. Ellie had not slept, not even for a moment. Her eyes had remained open, staring out into the dark horizon, where danger still seemed to lurk just beyond the reach of the fading night. The battle from the night before had been only the first of many, and Ellie knew the road ahead would be fraught with more violence, more bloodshed. The outlaws wouldn't stop, not after what had happened. Her father still slept lightly, his face drawn and weary as he lay in the corner, wrapped in his coat. But Ellie couldn't afford to wait any longer. They were going to come for her farm again, and this time, they wouldn't be caught off guard. Ellie moved quietly through the barn, her boots making little sound on the packed dirt as she checked her revolver. The cold steel was familiar in her hand, comforting even. This was the world she knew, the world she had been trained for. It wasn't the life she had wanted, but it was the life she had been given. She stepped outside, the morning air crisp and cool, the faint scent of pine carried on the wind. The farm stretched out before her, the peaceful landscape a stark contrast to the chaos she had just endured. But Ellie couldn't let herself be fooled by the calm. The world outside her farm was dangerous, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the storm arrived. She made her way toward the far side of the barn, where she kept the spare horses and some of the supplies. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to give her a fighting chance. She needed to be ready for anything. If the outlaws returned, she would have to be the one to defend her land, and she couldn't afford to be unprepared. Ellie's thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise in the distance. The sound of hooves, faint at first, but unmistakable. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. They were here. The outlaws were back. She turned and hurried back to the barn, where her father was now stirring, his eyes blinking as he slowly came to. He had always been a man of few words, but there was no mistaking the concern that clouded his features as he saw the look on his daughter's face. "Ellie," he began, his voice groggy from sleep. "What is it?" "They're coming," she replied, her voice tight with urgency. "We don't have much time." Her father quickly rose, grabbing his rifle from its resting place. His movements were slower now, his body aching from years of labor, but he still had the same fire in his eyes, the same determination. Ellie knew he would fight beside her to the end. "Let's make sure they don't get any closer," he said, his voice low and steady. Ellie nodded, her hand tightening around her revolver. "We'll make them regret ever coming here." The hooves grew louder, and Ellie's breath quickened. She moved into position, taking cover behind the stack of hay just outside the barn, her father beside her, rifle raised. They both watched as the riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes growing clearer as they neared the farm. There were 5 of them this time, all mounted and armed. The leader, the same man Ellie had shot in the leg the night before, was in the front, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and hatred. The others were close behind him, their eyes scanning the land, their hands resting on their weapons. "Get ready," Ellie murmured to her father. "We need to catch them off guard." He nodded, his gaze never leaving the riders. "No hesitation, Ellie. We finish this." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. She had trained for this moment, and now it was time to put everything she had learned to use. She would protect her farm. She would protect her father. And she would make sure no one ever threatened them again. The riders grew closer, their pace slowing as they neared the barn. The leader's voice rang out, loud and clear. "We're not here to negotiate, girl," he shouted. "We want what's ours. And you're going to give it to us, or we'll take it by force." Ellie stood up, her revolver raised, her voice cold and steady. "You've already taken enough from me." Before the leader could respond, Ellie fired, the shot ringing out in the still morning air. The bullet struck the leader in the chest, sending him tumbling off his horse and into the dirt. The other riders froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. Her father took his shot next, the rifle crackling through the air. One of the outlaws fell from his horse, clutching his side in pain. The remaining 3 riders drew their guns, but it was too late. Ellie was already moving, her feet light as she ran toward the nearest rider. She fired once, twice, hitting the man square in the chest, and he dropped without a sound. Ellie's heart raced as she moved to the next rider, firing once more. This time, the bullet found its mark and the man fell, his horse bolting in fear. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. The final rider tried to make a run for it, spurring his horse into motion, but Ellie was faster. Her revolver cracked again, and the rider fell to the ground with a scream. Silence. The farm was still. The riders were all down, their bodies scattered across the dirt. Ellie stood in the middle of it all, her gun still raised, her chest heaving with the exertion of the fight. Her father slowly lowered his rifle, his eyes scanning the area to ensure no one else had come. "You all right?" her father asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Ellie nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We're fine. For now." Her father glanced at the bodies on the ground, his face hardening. "They won't stop coming, Ellie. You know that." Ellie's gaze hardened as she looked down at the men she had just killed. "I know. But this time we're ready." As the morning sun rose higher, Ellie and her father stood together in the aftermath of the battle, the stillness of the farm settling around them. The farm was still theirs, for now, but Ellie knew it wouldn't stay that way forever. The outlaws would return. They always did, and Ellie would be ready. The early morning sun bathed the land in a soft, golden glow, but Ellie didn't feel the warmth of it. The farm, still and quiet, held an ominous weight. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, blood, and the remnants of the fight. The bodies of the outlaws lay scattered across the dirt, their faces frozen in shock and pain, but the danger wasn't over. Ellie knew that as surely as the sun had risen, her father, always the pragmatist, was already moving around, inspecting the scene. He moved slowly, carefully, his eyes scanning the bodies of the fallen men. His hands were steady as he removed the rifles and pistols from the outlaws' bodies, taking inventory of their weapons. They would need them, if not to fight, then to ensure they were prepared for whatever was to come next. Ellie, though tired, felt a surge of determination. She had faced worse. She had survived worse. But this time, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about keeping the farm, the land she had grown up on, and the future that was slipping away. It was about stopping the cycle of violence before it consumed them. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her hand trembling slightly, but she pushed the weakness aside. There was no room for weakness here. Not in a world where men like the ones she had just killed could appear without warning, threatening to take everything from her. Her father approached her, his gaze somber. "They'll come back," he said quietly, his voice tinged with the weight of experience. "They won't give up this easily. And there's more out there. More men willing to do whatever it takes to take our land." Ellie nodded, her jaw clenched in resolve. She knew what he was saying. They had fought for the land. But in this unforgiving world, it wasn't just enough to fight once. If they were going to keep what was theirs, they'd have to fight again and again. "We're not letting them take it," Ellie said firmly. "Not now, not ever." Her father's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Pride, yes, but also a quiet sadness. He knew what this meant. He knew it wasn't just about defending a farm anymore. It was about surviving in a world where violence could strike at any moment. "We've got to prepare," he said, his voice resolute, but with a hint of weariness. "I'll finish gathering the supplies. You need to rest. You've done more than enough." Ellie didn't respond immediately. She turned away and walked toward the edge of the farm, her mind racing. She could still hear the echoes of the gunfire, the sound of the outlaws' bodies hitting the dirt, their final breaths filling the air with the sharp sting of finality. It was hard not to feel the weight of it. Killing was never easy, even when the men were trying to kill you first. But Ellie knew she couldn't afford to feel regret. Not now. Not when she had to be ready for whatever came next. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. Her pulse quickened as she turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. Had they come back already? Ellie's hand instinctively went to her revolver, her fingers brushing the cold steel, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to be caught off guard again. The hooves grew louder, the sound of multiple riders approaching. Ellie's gaze scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the shapes moving in the distance. There were at least 6 riders, maybe more. Her stomach twisted in anticipation. "Pa," she called over her shoulder. "We've got company." Her father, who had been gathering the last of the supplies, dropped what he was holding and quickly moved toward her, rifle raised, his face hard with determination. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice low and steady. Ellie didn't argue. She crouched behind a nearby barrel, keeping her eyes on the approaching riders, trying to gauge their intentions. They were too far out to be sure, but their approach was slow, deliberate. They weren't rushing toward the farm. They were circling, looking for weaknesses. Ellie's mind raced, calculating the possibilities. They had to make their move before the riders decided to surround them. She couldn't let them get too close. Her father motioned for her to move back, toward the barn, and Ellie nodded. They'd take their stand there. It was the best vantage point. The barn would give them the cover they needed to hold their ground. As they made their way toward the barn, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. This wasn't just a raid, it was a test of whether or not they were strong enough to defend what they had. Ellie knew that if they survived this next encounter, they might have a chance at keeping the farm. But if they failed, everything would be lost. She crouched behind the wooden beams of the barn, watching as the riders continued to circle, their heads low as they scanned the area. They were looking for them. They didn't know where Ellie and her father were, yet. Ellie turned to her father, her voice barely above a whisper. "Get ready." Her father nodded, his eyes dark and resolute. He'd been through enough fights to know that this wasn't going to be easy. They'd have to outsmart the riders, outmaneuver them. It was the only way they'd survive. The riders were getting closer now, almost within range. Ellie's heart pounded, but she kept her focus sharp. They had to make this quick. If the riders were anything like the ones from last night, they would fight hard. But they wouldn't expect Ellie and her father to be waiting for them. Ellie glanced at her father, and without a word, he raised his rifle. They were ready. The riders made their final approach, still unaware of the trap being set for them. Ellie's fingers tightened on the grip of her revolver. The moment of truth was upon them. They had one shot, one chance to finish it. Her father fired first, the shot cracking through the still air, striking the lead rider and sending him sprawling from his horse. Ellie didn't wait. She raised her revolver and fired again, taking down another rider in quick succession. The remaining riders scattered, but it was too late. Ellie and her father were already moving, positioning themselves to finish the fight. The riders didn't stand a chance. Ellie's heart beat fast, but her aim was steady. Each shot found its mark, and one by one, the riders fell. There was no mercy. Not now. Not when they had come so close to taking everything Ellie held dear. When the last rider lay motionless in the dirt, Ellie stood, her breath heavy but steady. The farm was still theirs. For now. The sun was dipping lower in the sky as the last rider's body hit the ground with a final, lifeless thud. Ellie stood motionless for a moment, her revolver still raised in her hand, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of her breath. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the fight was beginning to fade, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. But there was no time to rest, not yet. Her father, his rifle still raised but now lowering as the threat passed, moved toward her. The tension between them was thick, like the air after a storm, and for a brief moment, Ellie allowed herself to lower her gun. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. "Well," her father said, his voice hoarse from the shouting and the stress of battle, "they won't be bothering us again." Ellie glanced at the bodies of the fallen men, her eyes cold. For now. Her father nodded grimly, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "They'll tell their friends what happened here. Word'll get out." She knew he was right. No matter how much they fought, how many times they pushed the outlaws back, the frontier was a place where violence was never far away. Ellie's hand tightened around her revolver once more. She could feel the weight of the weapon, a comforting, familiar presence. But even more, she felt the weight of everything, of the farm, her father, and the future she was trying so desperately to hold on to. "We've got to get rid of the bodies," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the lingering tension. "We don't want anyone to see them. It'll only draw more attention." Her father sighed, the years weighing heavy on his shoulders. He had never been a man to shy away from hard work, but even he had his limits. "You're right. Let's get it done quick." The two of them worked in silence, their movements synchronized from years of shared labor. The outlaws had no use for the farm now that they were dead, but their presence here was an unwelcome reminder that they had to always be vigilant. Ellie glanced up at the sky, watching the sun inch lower with every passing minute. The evening was drawing near, and she felt the familiar pang of worry gnaw at her. As they finished dragging the bodies into the trees and covering them with what little they could find, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of these men. The darkness was creeping in, not just on the land, but on her mind as well. Each raid, each fight, drew her deeper into a cycle of survival. But Ellie knew that there was only so much she could do alone, and her father was getting older. She couldn't always rely on him to help defend the farm. The thought stung, but Ellie pushed it aside for the moment. There was no time for self-doubt now. With the bodies hidden and the farm temporarily secure, they headed back inside. Ellie lit a lantern in the barn, the warm glow flickering in the otherwise darkened space. Her father leaned against the wall, his arms folded over his chest. His face was etched with the weariness of too many long years. "Pa, we can't keep doing this," Ellie said, her voice quiet but firm. "This farm, this land, it's too important to let it slip away. I can't let it happen." Her father's tired eyes met hers. He had seen it all in his years. He had seen the bloodshed, the hardship, the constant struggle to keep what little they had. But something in Ellie's voice made him pause. She wasn't just talking about the farm anymore. She was talking about survival. "I know, Ellie," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "but I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting. The world's changing. The land's changing. I don't know if we can win against everything that's coming." Ellie took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the words, the fear in his voice. But she couldn't let him carry that burden alone. Not now. "You've taught me everything I know," she said, her voice steady. "I'll keep fighting. For both of us. For this farm. For the future." Her father studied her for a long moment, as if trying to see past the resolve in her eyes. Finally, he gave a small nod, his lips tight. "I know you will," he said softly. "Just don't lose yourself in this fight, Ellie. Don't let it take everything from you." Ellie felt a pang in her chest at the tenderness in his voice. Her father was a man who had always held his emotions close, rarely showing vulnerability. But now, she could see it in his eyes. The toll this life had taken on him. She was his daughter, and he had spent so many years protecting her from the worst of the world. But now, the world was here, and there was no protecting her from it anymore. "I won't," Ellie said firmly, though her heart twisted with the weight of her promise. As they sat in the silence of the barn, Ellie's thoughts turned to the road ahead. The men who had come to her farm were just a small part of a much larger, much more dangerous world. She knew that there would be more outlaws, more violence, more bloodshed. But she also knew that she couldn't let fear rule her life. She had to stand tall, just as she had done last night, and just as she would do again. "Pa, I'm going to make sure we're ready," she said, standing and brushing off the dirt from her clothes. "I'll make sure they never take what's ours." Her father didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, his gaze full of something Ellie couldn't quite read. Pride, worry, or both. Finally, he spoke. "I'll help you," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes." Ellie nodded. This wasn't just her fight. It was their fight. They couldn't stop the world from changing, but they could make sure it wouldn't take them down. The morning sun was barely over the horizon when Ellie rose from the makeshift cot she had slept on in the barn. She hadn't slept much, The thought of what might come next had kept her wide-eyed through the night. The quiet after the battle had been a temporary relief, but she knew that it wouldn't last long. The men who had come to her farm were only the beginning. Her father had already risen, his worn boots steady on the ground as he checked their rifles and ensured they were both ready for whatever was coming. Despite his age, he moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, his every motion a reminder of the life he had led. Ellie took a deep breath, steadying herself for the day ahead. The farm was still hers, for now, but the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. The outlaws had been a warning, and Ellie knew that their next move was going to determine whether she would keep her land or lose everything. Her father glanced at her as she approached, his face grim but resolute. "We've got a few hours before anything else might happen," he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "We'll need to stay sharp, Ellie. Keep our eyes open." Ellie nodded, her mind already racing through every possible scenario. The outlaws who had come to the farm had been part of something bigger, of that she was certain. They weren't just petty thieves. They were part of a larger group, likely looking to take control of the valley. The fact that they had returned so quickly meant they were either highly organized or desperate. Either way, they would be back. "I'm going to make sure the perimeter is secure," Ellie said, looking out toward the field where the remnants of the outlaws' horses had been left. "We need to know if anyone else is coming." Her father nodded, turning back toward the rifle he had been cleaning. "Be careful, Ellie. They'll try to get the drop on us if they can." Ellie didn't need to be told twice. She had seen too much of what the world had to offer, too much of what men like the outlaws were capable of. She wouldn't make the mistake of letting her guard down again. With a steady pace, Ellie made her way out toward the edges of the farm. She took her time, making sure to move quietly through the fields, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, their leaves whispering in the wind, but there was an underlying tension in the air, one that Ellie couldn't shake. She had been raised on this land. She knew every tree, every hill, every fence, and every stone on the property. It was hers, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. As she made her way around the perimeter, her eyes caught a glimpse of something just beyond the tree line. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. She paused, her breath steady as she squinted into the distance. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her something was wrong. Ellie's hand went instinctively to her revolver, her fingers brushing the handle as she carefully crept toward the source of the disturbance. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves, making it harder to hear any approaching footsteps, but Ellie was focused, moving with the caution of a seasoned fighter. The shadow reappeared, a figure, tall and cloaked in the distance, moving quickly between the trees. She couldn't see their face, but she knew one thing. They were here for a reason. Ellie's pulse quickened as the figure drew closer, and she slipped behind a tree, her breath shallow as she waited. She had to stay hidden until she knew who, or what was out there. The figure emerged fully from the trees, and Ellie felt a surge of recognition. It wasn't an outlaw, it was Jesse. He was one of the few men she had ever trusted beyond her father. He had been a stranger when he had arrived, a man with a reputation for being both a drifter and a protector. She had seen him fight, and she had seen the way he carried himself. A man who wasn't afraid of violence, but knew when to hold back. Jesse had been the one who had warned her about the gang's plans, the one who had shared his knowledge of the outlaws. But even with his help, Ellie wasn't sure they were prepared for what was coming. "Ellie," Jesse said quietly as he saw her emerge from her hiding spot, his face expressionless but his eyes filled with urgency. "I've seen more riders. They're making their way through the valley." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" "At least a dozen. They're coming in from the west." Ellie cursed under her breath. The west side of the valley was the most vulnerable. There were fewer natural barriers and open fields that could be easily spotted by anyone who had a mind to take the land. If the outlaws were coming from there, they were planning something big. "We need to get to the ridge," Ellie said quickly. "It's the only place where we'll have the high ground. We can't let them get any closer." Jesse didn't argue. He understood as well as Ellie did that the advantage of the ridge was their best shot. It was the only way they could see the full picture of what was coming. As they headed toward the ridge, The ground beneath their feet felt heavier, the weight of the coming battle pressing on them. The wind picked up, the gusts colder as they neared the high ground, and Ellie felt a flicker of doubt creep into her thoughts. The truth was, she was scared. Not for herself, but for everything she had worked for. Everything that was about to be tested. When they reached the ridge, Ellie stood at the edge, looking out over the valley. The sky had darkened slightly, and the air felt thick, as though something was about to break. Jesse stepped up beside her, his eyes scanning the landscape. "They're coming," he muttered. "And this time, they're bringing everything they've got." Ellie didn't respond at first. She just kept her eyes on the distant horizon, watching as the first signs of movement appeared through the trees. The riders were getting closer, their horses kicking up dust as they made their way toward the farm. Ellie's grip tightened on her revolver, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. This was it, the final battle for her farm, and she wasn't going to let them take it. The wind howled through the trees, the first sign of the coming storm. Ellie could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as she watched the riders approach, their figures growing clearer with each passing second. They were coming for her, and this time, there would be no easy victory. She had prepared for this, but that didn't mean she wasn't afraid. The weight of the decision to stay and fight hung heavy on her shoulders. She had chosen this path. There was no turning back now. But the fear, deep down, was still there, curling like a snake in her chest. It was the fear of losing her farm, her land, the life she had built with her father. It was the fear of losing everything she had fought for. Her father stood beside her, his rifle steady in his hands, his gaze fixed on the riders. Jesse, too, was tense, his eyes scanning the valley, taking in every detail, every movement. The three of them had been through so much, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight to survive. This was a fight for their future. Ellie turned to her father. "Are you ready, Pa?" He nodded, his face grim. "We don't have much time. We need to make our stand now, or they'll take us before we know it." Ellie gave a sharp nod. She could feel the weight of her father's words, the urgency in his voice. There was no more room for hesitation. They were here, and they had no choice but to face them head-on. Jesse spoke up, his voice low and steady. "I'll take the west side. You two cover the east. We don't let them surround us." Ellie didn't need to argue. She trusted Jesse, just as she trusted her father. They had been through enough together. They were a team, and now they had to prove it. Without another word, they moved into position, each of them taking a spot that would give them the best chance of fighting back. Ellie crouched low behind a large rock, her revolver ready in her hands, her senses alert. She could hear the riders getting closer now, their voices rising as they approached. Ellie's heart raced, but she kept her focus. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The riders were close now, too close. She knew they would try to rush them, to force them into submission, but Ellie wasn't about to let that happen. She glanced at her father, who was crouched behind a tree, his rifle aimed carefully. He caught her eye, giving her a small nod. It was a silent signal. They were ready. The riders came into view, their horses kicking up dust as they rode toward the farm. There were more than a dozen of them, maybe 15 in total. They were organized, moving in a tight formation, their eyes scanning the land as they neared the farm. The leader, the same man Ellie had shot in the leg the night before, was at the front, his face twisted with hatred. Ellie's grip tightened on her revolver as the riders drew closer, but she didn't move. She had to wait for the right moment. She had to be patient. The leader raised his hand, signaling the others to slow down. His eyes scanned the farm, taking in the layout of the land. He was looking for weaknesses, and Ellie wasn't about to give him the chance. "Looks like we've got ourselves a bit of a fight," the leader called out, his voice loud and mocking. "I thought a little girl and her old man wouldn't be much trouble, but I'm not so sure now." Ellie's jaw clenched, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. The man had underestimated her, just like the others had, but she wouldn't let him get away with it. The leader continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You've made a mistake, little lady. You should have just handed over your land when we asked. Now, we'll take it by force. And you," he pointed a finger at her, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "You'll regret crossing us." Ellie didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her actions would do the talking. Suddenly, the sound of hooves pounding the earth filled the air, and Ellie's heart skipped a beat. The riders were charging. Without thinking, Ellie rose from her position and fired, her shot striking the leader square in the chest. The man's eyes widened in shock as he fell off his horse, his body jerking with the force of the bullet. Chaos erupted immediately. The riders scattered, pulling their guns as they tried to return fire, but Ellie was already moving. She ducked behind a nearby tree, taking cover as her father fired his rifle. One of the outlaws dropped, his body jerking as the bullet found its mark. Ellie's breath quickened as she moved into position, firing once, twice, taking down 2 more riders in quick succession. She was fast, precise, her aim never wavering. But there were still too many of them. They had to be stopped, or they would overrun the farm. Jesse's voice rang out from the other side of the valley. "They're flanking us from the west. We need backup." Ellie's eyes narrowed. They couldn't afford to let them get too close. She fired again, taking down another rider who had tried to make a run for it. Her father's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your ground, Ellie. We can't let them get past us." Ellie didn't hesitate. She fired once more, dropping another rider. The remaining men were starting to retreat, but they weren't giving up easily. They were regrouping, preparing to charge again. But this time, they weren't prepared for Ellie's response. She moved quickly, staying low to the ground as she advanced on them, her revolver crackling in the air. With one final shot, she took down the last rider, the man falling from his horse with a scream of defeat. Silence settled over the farm again. The riders were gone. The danger had passed, for now. Ellie stood, her chest heaving with the intensity of the fight, her body covered in sweat and dirt. Her father was already on his feet, his rifle lowered, his eyes scanning the field. Jesse emerged from the west, his face hard but relieved. "We did it," Ellie said, her voice low but filled with quiet triumph. "For now." Her father gave a brief nod, his gaze never leaving the landscape. "But it won't be the last time. They'll keep coming. We need to be ready." Ellie's eyes hardened. "We will be." As the sun set behind them, Ellie felt the weight of the day settle over her. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over, and Ellie Hayes wasn't about to lose. The night had fallen quickly, the darkness swallowing the land, but Ellie could not bring herself to rest. The fight from earlier was still fresh in her mind, the sounds of gunfire and the sight of men falling before her haunting her thoughts. She had survived, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The farm was quiet now, eerily so. Her father had gone to bed, exhausted from the day's events, but Ellie couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of the barn, watching the stars flicker in the dark sky, trying to make sense of the chaos. The outlaws had come back, and they had attacked in full force, but what they didn't know was that they had only managed to stir a sleeping giant. Ellie had always known there was more to their land than just crops and livestock. Her father's warnings, the tales of hidden treasure, whispers of old maps. She had brushed them off as nothing more than old frontier rumors. But now, she couldn't ignore it. They were after something beyond the land. The thought gnawed at her. What was it they were truly after? Why had the men been so determined to take her farm? Her hand rested lightly on the barrel of her revolver, the weight of the gun both familiar and heavy. She had taken down so many men already, and yet it never felt like enough. Each shot, each life lost, weighed on her conscience. But in this world, there was no room for mercy. Not when your life was on the line. Suddenly, a faint noise pulled Ellie's attention away from her thoughts. A soft rustling sound, barely audible over the wind. She tensed, her senses alert. Someone was moving outside the barn. She rose from her spot by the window, her movements slow and cautious. Her father was still inside, asleep. He hadn't heard it, or he wasn't concerned. But Ellie couldn't afford to ignore it. She grabbed her revolver, checking to make sure it was fully loaded. She moved toward the door of the barn, her boots silent against the floor. As she stepped outside, she paused for a moment, scanning the area around her. The moonlight cast long shadows over the land, and the night was still, too still. The rustling continued, closer now. Ellie's grip tightened on the gun as she crouched low behind a stack of firewood, her eyes darting between the barn and the empty field in front of her. She could feel the presence, a faint pressure on the air that made her skin crawl. It wasn't the wind. It was someone, or something else. The rustling grew louder, but this time it was followed by a soft whisper. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just one person. There was a group of them, and they were too close. Her mind raced as she calculated her next move. She couldn't afford to be reckless. Whoever was out there was either scouting or preparing for something larger. But why wait until the middle of the night? What was it they were after? A figure stepped into view, his face obscured by the darkness. Ellie's hand moved instinctively to her revolver, but she paused, recognizing the silhouette. It was Jesse. She exhaled slowly, lowering her weapon. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice sharp with suspicion. Jesse stepped forward, his expression tense. "We've got trouble." Ellie's pulse quickened again. What kind of trouble? Jesse's eyes flickered toward the barn, his voice barely above a whisper. "The kind that won't stop. There's something else going on here, Ellie. Something bigger than just men looking for a quick payday." Ellie frowned, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you talking about?" He looked over his shoulder, checking to make sure no one else was listening. "I've been digging around, asking a few questions. The gang, those men who came here last night, they're part of something much larger. They're not just bandits. They've been sent here by someone, and that someone has a lot of power." Ellie's mind raced, trying to piece together the information. Who's behind this? Jesse hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice low. "I don't know, but I've heard rumors. There's talk of a land grab. Not just this valley, but all the land in the surrounding areas. Some people are looking to consolidate power, to build an empire in the West." Ellie's blood ran cold. "They've been using us as a stepping stone." "Exactly," Jesse said. "And there's more to it. There's a map, rumor has it. An old map that leads to a cache of gold buried somewhere in these hills. Whoever controls the land controls the wealth. And that's what they want. The land, the gold. They'll do whatever it takes to get it." Ellie took a step back, her mind reeling. The land, the farm she had worked so hard to protect. It wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a prize. Something far more valuable than she had ever realized. "Then we're not just fighting for survival," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the shock. "We're fighting for the future." Jesse's eyes met hers, his expression grim. "That's right. And it won't be easy. We've made enemies. Dangerous enemies." Ellie's thoughts were already racing ahead. The map, the treasure. It was all connected to the men who had come for her farm. But now that she understood the bigger picture, she knew she couldn't afford to wait for the next attack. She had to take control. "We need to find that map," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "Before they do. And we need to find out who's behind all this." Jesse nodded, his face hardening. "Agreed. But it won't be easy. Whoever has the map will be well guarded. And if they catch wind of us looking, they'll make sure we never find it." Ellie's eyes narrowed as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "Then we'll have to outsmart them. We don't have much time. If we're going to stop them, we need to move fast." Jesse didn't argue. He stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "I'll help you find it, Ellie. But we're in this together. We can't do it alone." Ellie's resolve hardened. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. Whatever was hidden in the hills, whatever treasure the outlaws were after, she wouldn't let them take it without a fight. Not while she still had breath in her lungs. "We'll do this my way," Ellie said, her voice cold with determination. "We'll take the fight to them." The night was still, but Ellie knew the storm was just beginning. The night was heavy with anticipation, and Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. She had learned quickly that in a world like this, hesitation could mean death. The outlaws had come for her farm, and now they wanted something far greater than land. They were after power, gold, riches, and a piece of the West that she couldn't afford to lose. She stood with Jesse, both of them now fully aware of the dangerous game they were playing. This wasn't just about defending her farm anymore. It was about a fight for something bigger than either of them could have imagined. The outlaws had the map, but Ellie wasn't about to let them take it without a fight. The early morning light began to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the valley. Jesse had already started to make preparations, gathering what supplies they would need for the hunt. The map, if it existed, was their only lead. If they could find it first, they might have a chance of turning the tables. Ellie's father had insisted on staying back at the farm, though Ellie knew he wasn't happy about it. He had always been the one to lead, to protect his family, but Ellie knew the time had come for her to take the reins. Her father was tired, his age catching up with him, and while his wisdom was invaluable, it was Ellie who had to lead the charge. Jesse moved toward her, his eyes scanning the valley. The men who came here last night didn't just know the farm. They know the land. They're probably out looking for that map right now. If we're going to find it, we need to move fast. Ellie nodded. We'll head toward the ridge first. From there, we can see everything. We need to keep our eyes peeled for any signs they might have left behind. They made their way through the trees, their steps light but purposeful. Ellie's heart was pounding in her chest, but her mind was sharp. The map was somewhere out there, hidden among the hills. If it was real, it could change everything. As they reached the base of the ridge, Ellie paused, her eyes sweeping across the land. The sun had risen higher now, casting the world in a golden hue, but it didn't bring peace. There was still an underlying tension in the air, a feeling that something was watching them. Jesse turned to her, his face grim. We'll climb to the top. We can spot anything from there. They made their way up the ridge, the ground rough and uneven beneath their boots. Ellie's hand rested lightly on the grip of her revolver, her senses alert to every sound. The wind had picked up again, rustling the trees and filling the air with a low, haunting hum. When they finally reached the top of the ridge, Ellie stopped, her breath coming in shallow gasps. From this vantage point, they could see for miles. The valley stretched out before them, dotted with trees, rocky outcrops, and the faint outlines of other farms in the distance. But Ellie wasn't looking for the landscape. She was looking for signs, any clues that the outlaws had been here before. Jesse scanned the area, his sharp eyes picking out small details. Look there, he said, pointing to a small group of trees to the east. That's where they've been. See the broken branches? Ellie squinted, narrowing her gaze on the area he indicated. The trees were disturbed, the branches bent in ways that didn't seem natural. It was a sign that someone had been through there recently, and they hadn't been careful. Ellie's heart beat faster. Let's go. They moved quickly, but quietly, making their way toward the trees. The ground was uneven, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Every step they took felt like it might be the one that gave them away, but Ellie pressed forward, her resolve firm. As they reached the disturbed area, Ellie crouched down, inspecting the ground. She could see footprints, fresh ones. They were deep, clear signs that someone had been here recently. The outlaws had definitely passed through, and they weren't far ahead. Jesse knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the tracks. They went this way, he murmured. I think we're getting closer. Ellie didn't wait for him to finish. She was already moving, following the tracks through the trees. She had to find them, had to get to the map before the outlaws did. She wasn't about to let them take what was hers. The forest grew denser as they moved deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around them. The sounds of nature were muffled here. The only noise the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of animals moving in the underbrush. But Ellie wasn't focused on anything but the path ahead. Finally, they reached a small clearing. The ground was covered in leaves, and there were signs of movement. Branches broken, dirt disturbed, but no bodies. No sign of anyone. Jesse frowned. They're close. We just missed them. Ellie's mind raced. The map had to be here. She could feel it. She crouched down, inspecting the ground carefully. She ran her fingers through the dirt, her eyes scanning the area for any clue that might lead them to the treasure. Suddenly, her hand brushed against something cold. Ellie's pulse quickened as she pulled it out of the dirt. An old, weathered wooden box, half buried in the earth. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, the hinges creaking. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. The map, Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she unrolled it. The markings were faded, but the symbols were clear. It was a map of the valley, showing landmarks, rivers, and a trail that led deeper into the hills. But there was something else, something that made Ellie's heart skip a beat. An X marked just beyond the ridge, near the old creek. This was it. This was what they had been looking for. "We found it," she whispered, her voice full of disbelief. The map. Jesse crouched beside her, his eyes wide as he examined the paper. "This is it. This is what they've been after." Ellie stood up, clutching the map tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as she thought about the danger they had just uncovered. Whoever was behind the outlaws knew about this map, and they would stop at nothing to get it. "We need to move," Ellie said, her voice filled with urgency. "We have to get back to the farm, and we need to warn my father." This is just the beginning. As they turned to leave, Ellie felt the weight of the map in her hands. The outlaws were close, but so was the end of this war. The fight for her farm, for her future, had just taken a new turn, and Ellie Hayes was ready to face it. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the chill of the approaching storm. Ellie's fingers were numb from holding the map so tightly, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. Her heart pounded in her chest as she and Jesse made their way back toward the farm, their footsteps quick and quiet. The discovery of the map had only confirmed what Ellie had feared. This wasn't just a fight for her land. It was a fight for something much bigger, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. They moved swiftly through the trees, but the sense of urgency pressing on Ellie's chest made it feel like time was slipping away. The outlaws were already close, and the knowledge that they were coming for what was now in her possession made Ellie's blood run cold. If they got their hands on the map, it would be the end of everything. "Do you think they know we found it?" Jesse's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone low and cautious. Ellie didn't answer right away, her eyes scanning the surroundings as they neared the edge of the forest. She didn't know if the outlaws had figured it out yet, but she didn't plan on taking any chances. "They'll figure it out soon enough," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "We need to get back to the farm and warn Pa. If they come looking for us, we'll be ready." Jesse nodded, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. He had been through his share of battles and close calls, but even he knew that the men they were facing were different. They were organized, ruthless, and they had a reason for being so determined. As they approached the edge of the forest, the sounds of the farm came into focus. The soft whinny of the horses, the rustle of the wind in the grass. Everything seemed normal, but Ellie knew better. There was no such thing as normal anymore. "We're almost there," Jesse said, his voice barely above a whisper. He shifted his stance, scanning the area with quick, practiced eyes. Ellie motioned for him to hold back as they reached the tree line. She crept forward, carefully making her way toward the barn. There were no signs of movement yet, but she knew they couldn't afford to relax. The outlaws were good at being quiet, at slipping through unnoticed. Her father had taught her that silence was often more dangerous than noise. She reached the barn door and paused, listening for any sign of movement inside. It was still, too still. Ellie's heart raced, and she motioned for Jesse to cover the back as she slowly pushed the door open. Her eyes quickly scanned the room, her body tense as she listened for any signs of trouble. And then she saw it. Her father was sitting by the table, his face hidden in his hands, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. But next to him was a figure she hadn't expected. Another man, tall and cloaked in shadow, standing by the window. His face was hidden, but there was no mistaking the silhouette. Ellie's hand went to her revolver, but before she could make a move, her father looked up, his eyes wide with recognition. "Ellie, get back," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Before Ellie could react, the stranger spoke, his voice low and smooth. "You're quick, girl, but not quick enough." Ellie froze. Her gun was still drawn, but she didn't dare make the first move. Something was wrong. This man knew too much. "I don't have time to play games," the stranger continued. "I'm here for the map." Ellie's pulse quickened. It wasn't one of the outlaws from the previous night. This was someone else, someone who had been watching them, someone who had been waiting. "Who are you?" Ellie demanded, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The stranger smirked, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Names don't matter much out here. What matters is that I've been hired to get that map, and you're in the way." Her father stood up slowly, his hand moving toward the rifle he had leaned against the wall. "We've already been through enough today," he growled, his voice rough with fatigue. "You want the map? You'll have to take it from my daughter's cold, dead hands." Ellie's eyes met her father's, and in that moment, she knew. There was no negotiating, no backing down. This man, whoever he was just another player in a larger game, and he wasn't about to stop until he had the map. Ellie was done running. She was done hiding. With a swift motion, she raised her revolver, her aim steady as she pointed it at the man. "You won't get a chance to try." The stranger raised his hands slowly, as if unfazed by the weapon aimed at him. "You think you're the only one who's good with a gun, girl?" He chuckled, his voice dark and mocking. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with." Ellie's finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could pull it, the sound of hooves echoed from outside the barn. She froze. The sound was unmistakable. More riders were approaching. "We've got company." Jesse's voice rang out from behind the barn, his tone urgent. Ellie's eyes flickered to the stranger, then back to her father. There was no time to waste. They had to move. She quickly turned to the stranger, her gaze unyielding. "You get one chance. Get out. Now." The man smirked, clearly amused by her threat. "You think you can stop all of us? You think you can outrun us?" Ellie didn't flinch. She fired once, a single shot that rang through the barn. It missed, but it was enough to send the message. The man's eyes widened as he took a step back, his hands dropping to his sides in a defensive gesture. "Get out," Ellie shouted. The man didn't hesitate this time. He turned, his coat billowing behind him, and fled into the darkening world outside. Ellie breathed a sigh of relief, but she knew it wasn't over. More riders were coming, and they were going to stop at nothing to get what they wanted. They had the map now, but Ellie knew it was only a matter of time before they would come back with a vengeance. "Jesse," Ellie said, turning to him as the sound of the riders grew louder. "We need to move. Now." Jesse nodded, his hand gripping his rifle tightly. "Let's get to the ridge. We'll make our stand there." Ellie glanced over at her father, who was already moving toward the door. "We'll fight them off. Together." The time for waiting was over. It was time for Ellie Hayes to take the fight to them. The ridge loomed ahead, casting a long shadow over the valley as Ellie, her father, and Jesse made their way toward it. The wind had picked up again, the chill in the air cutting through their clothes as they climbed the rough path. Ellie's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The map was in her possession, but that wasn't enough. She had seen what the outlaws were capable of, and she knew that it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about something far bigger, and if she didn't act now, it would slip from her grasp. The sound of hooves still echoed through the valley behind them, growing louder with every passing second. The riders were closing in, but Ellie didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She could hear the pounding of hooves, the unmistakable rhythm of a full group coming toward them. This wasn't just a skirmish anymore. This was war. Ellie's pulse quickened as she reached the top of the ridge, taking cover behind a large rock. Her father and Jesse flanked her, positioning themselves in the rocks to either side. From their vantage point, they could see the valley stretching out below them, their farm just barely visible in the distance. But the landscape, so familiar to Ellie, now felt alien. The valley was no longer just a place to work. It was a battleground. She pulled out the map again, looking over the symbols and markings. The X was clear. It led directly toward the hills just beyond the ridge, an area that Ellie had never fully explored. She had no idea what she would find there, but she knew she had to protect the map. They couldn't let the outlaws have it, no matter the cost. Her father's voice cut through the silence. "They're getting closer. We don't have much time." Ellie's heart raced as she rolled up the map and tucked it back into her jacket. She couldn't afford to be distracted by it now. The riders were almost on them, and they had to make their stand. Jesse moved forward, peering over the edge of the ridge. "I can count at least a dozen riders, and they're all armed. They'll try to surround us." Ellie nodded. "We'll have to make them come to us. Let them think they have the advantage. We've got the high ground, and we're not backing down." The sound of hooves grew louder, closer now. Ellie's grip tightened on her revolver. The riders were approaching quickly, their shadows visible against the setting sun. They had been close enough before to hear their mocking taunts and threats. Now, they were almost upon them. The first rider crested the ridge, his silhouette dark against the horizon. The others followed, fanning out as they reached the top. Ellie could see the leader among them, his face twisted with malice as he rode ahead of the others. "You really think you can keep this land?" the leader shouted, his voice carrying through the wind. "You think you've won?" Ellie's finger tightened on the trigger, but she held her fire. "We haven't won yet, but we're not giving up," the leader sneered. "You're making a mistake, little lady. We've come for the map, and we're not leaving without it. You can die here, or you can give it to us now." Ellie's heart raced as she raised her revolver, but she didn't fire. Not yet. The moment wasn't right. She had learned that patience was as much a weapon as the gun in her hand. "I'm not giving you anything," Ellie said, her voice steady and unwavering. "And if you want this farm, you'll have to take it from me." The leader chuckled darkly. "I was hoping you'd say that." He motioned to the other riders. "Get them." In an instant, the riders charged forward, their guns drawn. Ellie didn't hesitate. She fired first, the shot ringing out in the still air, hitting one of the men in the chest. He fell from his horse, but the others were already charging. The fight had begun. Ellie dove behind a boulder for cover, firing again as one of the riders drew close. She hit him in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley as her father fired from his position, taking down another rider who tried to flank them. Jesse was already moving, using the terrain to his advantage. He fired from the other side of the ridge, picking off riders with deadly precision. The outlaws were scattered, their advance slowing as they tried to regroup. But Ellie and her father weren't giving them a chance. Ellie moved swiftly, firing again as the next rider came into view. She hit him in the leg, causing him to collapse in the dirt. But there were still more. So many more. The leader, still on his horse, raised his rifle and aimed it at Ellie. Her heart skipped a beat as the shot rang out. She ducked behind the rock, feeling the air shift with the passing bullet. That was too close. Her father fired again, this time hitting the leader's horse, sending it rearing. The leader fell hard, but he didn't stay down for long. He pulled himself to his feet, his gun raised, his face contorted with rage. "Enough of this," the leader shouted, waving his gun toward the other riders. "We'll take them alive if we have to." Ellie's pulse quickened as she realized what he meant. They were trying to take her, and her father, alive. But she wouldn't let that happen. She couldn't. Jesse had already begun to move, charging toward the remaining riders. "Get to the horses," he shouted. "We can't stay here." Ellie didn't hesitate. She followed Jesse, her revolver drawn, moving toward the horses at the far end of the ridge. Her father was close behind her, covering their retreat with his rifle. They had to get to the horses. The farm was no longer safe, and they couldn't afford to be caught here. The fight wasn't over, but they had a chance to escape, to regroup and prepare for whatever came next. As they reached the horses, Ellie turned to look back. The leader was still on his feet, his men regrouping. They weren't giving up, and neither would Ellie. With a final glance at the ridge, she spurred her horse forward, leading the way down the narrow trail. Jesse followed, and her father brought up the rear, making sure no one was left behind. The outlaws would be on them again, but this time, Ellie would be ready. They all would be. The sound of hooves pounding against the ground was relentless, echoing through the night air as Ellie, her father, and Jesse raced away from the ridge. The farm was behind them now, left in their dust as the outlaws pursued, relentless and determined to finish what they had started. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was sharp, calculating. She had survived the battle on the ridge, but this was only the beginning. The map, the treasure, the land, none of it was safe yet. The outlaws wanted it all, and they would stop at nothing to get it. "Keep moving," Ellie shouted, urging her horse forward, her father and Jesse right behind her. They had barely made it out of the valley when the riders were still hot on their trail. Ellie's eyes darted over her shoulder, the silhouettes of the outlaws gaining ground. It was a race now, a fight to stay one step ahead. Jesse pulled up beside her, his face grim. They're not letting up. We need to find cover. Ellie nodded, scanning the land ahead. There was a dense patch of trees to the right, a perfect spot to make their stand. We can make it to the trees. We hold them off there. Her father didn't argue, though Ellie could see the strain in his eyes. He had aged over the years, and the toll of constant fighting and hard labor had started to show. But tonight, he was still with them, still fighting for what they had. Ellie and Jesse spurred their horses harder, the sound of the galloping hooves echoing in the stillness. They reached the trees quickly, pulling their horses to a halt just at the edge of the woods. The riders were close now, too close, but they weren't just going to give up. Not yet. Get behind the trees, Ellie ordered, her voice filled with urgency. Her father, though slower than the others, was still able to take cover behind the thick trunks, rifle ready. Ellie and Jesse took positions as well, crouching low, waiting for the inevitable. They didn't have to wait long. The first rider emerged from the trees, charging straight at them. Ellie fired first, her shot striking him square in the chest. He fell off his horse, but the others didn't stop. They rode in like a storm, the sound of hooves deafening as the group surrounded them. Ellie's hands were steady as she reloaded, firing again at a rider who tried to flank her. She missed, but only just. The rider pulled back, trying to regroup with his men. "We can't let them close," Jesse shouted, firing his rifle. Her father took a shot, sending another rider tumbling from his horse. But there were still too many of them, and the circle was tightening. Ellie's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. They couldn't keep this up forever. "We need a plan," Ellie muttered, trying to steady her breath. "There's no time," Jesse replied, reloading his rifle. "We hold them here, or we run." Ellie scanned the trees. There had to be something. Then she saw it, a ridge, not too far ahead. If they could break through the line, they could get to the high ground. It would give them the advantage. "Move to the ridge," Ellie shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Now!" Without hesitation, they spurred their horses into motion, galloping hard toward the ridge. The riders gave chase, but they weren't prepared for the sudden shift. Ellie pushed her horse harder, the sound of hooves drowning out everything else. Her father and Jesse followed closely behind, their horses pushing through the underbrush. Ellie could hear the riders close behind them, but she focused on the ridge. They had to make it. As they reached the ridge, Ellie turned to see the outlaws still in pursuit. But they were losing ground. The incline of the hill gave them the height advantage, and Ellie could feel the tide shifting. "We've got them," Jesse shouted, firing down at the riders below. Ellie's heart pounded, but she knew they couldn't stop now. They had to finish this. From the corner of her eye, she saw one of the outlaws break from the group, charging straight at her. The leader. She recognized the cruel sneer on his face as he closed in, his gun drawn. Ellie's pulse quickened, but her hands remained steady. This was it, the final confrontation. She wouldn't let him take everything she had fought for. Not now. With one final motion, she drew her revolver and fired. The shot rang out through the air, striking the leader square in the chest. He gasped in shock, his body jerking as he fell from his horse, landing with a heavy thud on the ground below. The remaining riders hesitated, their fear palpable. The leader was down, and the momentum had shifted. Ellie didn't waste a moment. She fired again, taking down another rider who had been trying to close the distance. The rest of the outlaws, seeing their numbers dwindle, began to retreat. The battle was over. Ellie stood on the ridge, her heart still racing, but the farm was safe, for now. Her father and Jesse were beside her, both breathing heavily from the exertion. "Is it over?" Jesse asked, looking down at the retreating riders. Ellie didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure. The outlaws had been stopped, but the war for the land, for the map, was far from finished. "We've won this round," Ellie said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "But they'll be back, and when they do, we'll be ready." Her father nodded, his face tired but filled with pride. "We'll fight for what's ours, Ellie. We always have." The three of them stood in silence, looking out over the valley. The land that had been threatened so many times, the land that had brought them so much pain and hardship, was still theirs. For now. But Ellie knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The valley was eerily quiet as the last of the riders fled, disappearing into the trees beyond the ridge. Ellie stood tall, her revolver still gripped tightly in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, and for a moment, it felt like everything had returned to normal. But Ellie knew better. The fight was far from over. Her father and Jesse stood with her, both of them surveying the aftermath of the battle. The bodies of the fallen outlaws lay scattered across the ground, their weapons strewn around them. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, and the silence that followed the gunfire was suffocating. But despite the quiet, Ellie could feel the storm that was still brewing. The outlaws would be back, and when they came, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. "We've bought some time," Jesse said, his voice low, but there was no joy in his words. "But that's all it is. Time." Ellie nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon, her thoughts racing. "We need to find out who's behind all of this. They won't stop at just one raid. They want something more." Her father spoke up, his voice gruff with exhaustion. "You're right, but we can't keep fighting like this forever. Sooner or later, we'll run out of bullets, or worse, out of people." Ellie's eyes hardened. She wasn't about to let that happen, not after everything she had fought for. "We'll keep fighting," she said, her voice firm. "We'll do whatever it takes." Jesse glanced at her, his eyes sharp, but his face softened with concern. "Ellie, you can't keep carrying this burden alone. It's too much. We need help." Ellie looked at him, her expression unwavering. "I won't let anyone take this farm, and if we need help, we'll find it. But right now, we don't have time to waste." Her father sighed, shaking his head slightly. "We'll need a plan. We can't just wait around here hoping for another victory." Ellie agreed. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. They had to be proactive, not reactive. She needed to learn everything about the gang that had attacked them. She needed to find out who was pulling the strings. "We'll track them down," Ellie said, determination clear in her voice. "We'll find their base of operations, and when we do, we take the fight to them. We'll finish it." Jesse hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's not that simple, Ellie. They're part of something bigger. This is about more than just land. They want control of everything." Ellie turned to him, her jaw set. "I don't care what they want. They'll have to go through me to get it." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his weathered fingers tightening with a mixture of pride and concern. "We'll stand by you, Ellie. You know that. But we need a plan, and we need to know who we're up against." Ellie nodded, turning her gaze back to the valley. The outlaws had retreated for now, but they would be back. She could feel it in her bones. They were out there, waiting, watching. But Ellie wasn't about to let them win. She had survived the first battle, and she would survive the next. But it wouldn't be enough to just fight. Ellie knew she had to be smarter than that. She needed to learn more about the outlaws, about their leader, about their plans. She needed to understand their weaknesses, and she would stop at nothing to uncover them. "We need to move quickly," Ellie said. "We can't wait for them to come to us. We'll take the fight to them." Jesse and her father exchanged a glance, then nodded. They knew as well as Ellie did that the time for waiting was over. The three of them made their way down from the ridge, each lost in their own thoughts as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The fight was far from over, and Ellie knew that the coming days would be even more dangerous. But she had made a promise, to herself, to her father, and to the land she had fought so hard to protect, that she would never back down. The road ahead would be long and hard, but Ellie Hayes was ready for whatever came next. The days blurred together as Ellie, her father, and Jesse prepared for the next phase of the fight. They couldn't stay in one place for long. Not when the outlaws could be anywhere, lurking just beyond the horizon. The farm was secure for now, but Ellie knew it wouldn't stay that way. The land, the map, it all had a target on it now, and the people behind the outlaws were not going to let go easily. Ellie spent most of her time in the barn, poring over the map again, memorizing every detail. The markings on the map were faded, but Ellie had learned to read the land, and she knew the areas the map pointed to. She had to find out what the outlaws were really after, and what they would do to get it. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees outside as the evening sky darkened. Jessie had gone out to gather supplies, while her father worked to reinforce the barn's defenses. Ellie hadn't said much to either of them. They were all on edge, their minds focused on the fight ahead. A knock at the door broke her concentration. Ellie looked up, instinctively reaching for her revolver, but she recognized the knock. A series of sharp raps that they had agreed on to signal a trusted ally. She quickly opened the door to find a familiar face standing in the dim light. It was Luke, a former neighbor, and one of the few people Ellie had ever trusted beyond her father. He had lived in the valley for years, working his own land until the outlaws had started to push everyone out. "You've got company?" Ellie asked, lowering her gun as she stepped aside. Luke entered, his face grim as he looked around. "Not yet, but I've seen some signs. Men on horseback, moving in from the east. I don't know who they are, but I'm guessing it's more trouble." Ellie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "We've been expecting them." "How many?" "Enough," Luke said, his voice low. "There's a dozen or more riders. I've seen them circling the area for the past couple of days, and I don't think they're just passing through." Ellie's mind raced as she motioned for Luke to sit. "What do we know about them?" Luke shook his head. "Not much, but they're organized. Whoever's behind them has eyes everywhere. They've been scouting, staying hidden, watching the farms and the roads." Her father came in from the back, his face tired but alert. "What's going on?" "More riders," Luke said. "This time from the east. They've been watching us, tracking movements. I think they're preparing for another raid." Ellie turned to her father. "We can't just wait for them to show up. We need to take the fight to them." Her father didn't hesitate. "We're not in a position to strike first, Ellie, but we can prepare. We'll hold our ground here." Ellie nodded, but her mind was already moving. They couldn't afford to wait for the outlaws to gather their forces. They had to hit them hard, hit them fast, before they could form a full assault. "I'll go out and scout," Ellie said, standing. "I know the terrain. If they're close, I can track them. If we know where they are, we can set an ambush." Her father gave her a hard look. "It's too dangerous. You've already been through enough, Ellie." "I'm not letting them take what's mine, Pa," she replied, her voice steady. "We've got a chance to stop them before they get any closer. I'm not letting that slip away." Luke stepped forward. "I'll go with you. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Ellie glanced at her father, who finally nodded, though his face was filled with concern. "Be careful, and come back in one piece." Ellie didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her rifle, strapped it to her back, and made her way toward the door. Luke followed closely behind her, his expression serious. The night had fallen thick around them as they left the barn, their boots silent on the dirt path. The air was colder now, and Ellie felt the weight of the task ahead of her. She had no illusions about what they were facing. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for their future. As they made their way through the trees, Ellie's eyes darted over every shadow, every movement. The darkness around them seemed to close in, but Ellie trusted the land. She knew it better than anyone. They made their way toward the east, sticking to the shadows as they neared the edge of the valley. Ellie's heart raced as she listened for any sound of movement. The tension in the air was thick, the quiet only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. And then there it was. A faint sound, hooves. Ellie signaled for Luke to stop, her eyes narrowing as she listened. The riders were close now. Luke crouched down beside her, his face tense. "They're not far. We can't let them spot us." Ellie nodded. They couldn't let the element of surprise slip away. They needed to get a better look at the outlaws, to figure out how many of them there were, and if they had any advantage. They crept closer, moving silently through the trees, until they were just on the edge of a clearing. Through the branches, Ellie could see them. Riders, clustered in small groups, seemingly waiting. But they weren't just waiting for nothing. Ellie's eyes flicked to the ground, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. A map, similar to the one she had. One of the riders was holding it in his hands, unfurled, its details clear even from this distance. "That's the map," Ellie whispered, her voice tight with realization. "They're after it. They don't know we've got it yet, but they're here for it." Luke's voice was low and urgent. "We need to get back to the farm. They're closer than we thought." Ellie nodded, her thoughts racing. If they got any closer, the outlaws would spot them. They had to make it back to the farm, but they couldn't leave without knowing the full extent of what they were dealing with. She motioned for Luke to follow as she slowly began to retreat, her mind working on a plan. They couldn't face the riders head-on, not yet, but they could set traps, use the land to their advantage. The outlaws were gathering, and Ellie would make sure they wouldn't get the chance to take what was hers. The chill of the night air bit at Ellie's skin as she and Luke silently made their way back to the farm, their movements quick and quiet. The sound of hooves was still fresh in her mind, the realization that the outlaws were closer than ever gnawing at her with every step. They had seen the map in their hands, but there was no doubt in Ellie's mind that the outlaws didn't yet know she had it. The advantage was still theirs, but it wouldn't last much longer. As they neared the barn, Ellie's heart raced. She could see the faint outline of the farmhouse in the distance, but she knew better than to believe the farm was safe. The riders had been close enough to spot their movements, and if they had been scouting, they likely knew the terrain as well as Ellie did. They had to act fast. Ellie stopped and motioned for Luke to crouch low, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. The wind had picked up, and the trees rustled in the darkness, making it harder to hear any approaching riders. She could feel the tension building in the air, like a storm just waiting to break. "Get to the barn," Ellie whispered, her voice low and urgent. "I'm going to circle around the back. We need to warn Pa and get the supplies together." Luke nodded, his face grim as he turned to head for the barn. Ellie watched him go for a moment, making sure he was safely out of sight before she darted toward the trees. She couldn't afford to be seen. The outlaws were too close, and there was too much at stake. She made her way along the edge of the property, her heart pounding with every step. The sound of hooves continued to echo in the distance, getting louder as the riders moved closer. Ellie couldn't help but feel the weight of the map in her jacket, knowing that it was their last hope. If the outlaws got their hands on it, everything would be lost. As she reached the back of the barn, she heard a soft voice call out to her. It was her father, standing in the shadows. "You're back," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "I saw you leave. What's going on?" Ellie stepped forward, her eyes scanning the area one last time before she spoke. "They're coming. The outlaws. I don't know how many, but they're closer than we thought." Her father's face tightened with concern. "We've got to get ready. If they're coming for the map, we don't have much time." Ellie nodded. "I've got a plan, Pa, but we need to move fast. They'll be here any minute." She quickly outlined her plan to her father, telling him where to set up defenses and how to prepare the supplies for an emergency retreat. They couldn't afford to be caught unprepared. Every minute counted. "We'll make our stand here," Ellie said, her voice steady. "We've got the high ground, and the barn is well fortified. If we hold them off long enough, we can make a break for it and get to the ridge." Her father gave a curt nod, already moving to carry out her instructions. He trusted her, just as he always had. Ellie had learned from the best, and she would make sure they wouldn't be caught off guard again. As she finished her preparations, the wind shifted, and the sound of hooves grew louder. They were here. "Get ready," Ellie said, her heart pounding. "This is it." She turned to Jesse, who had joined them in the barn, his rifle ready and his face tense. "We'll hold the front," Ellie said. "Make sure they don't get past us." Jesse nodded, his hand gripping the rifle tightly. "We'll fight to the end." Ellie's gaze swept over the barn one last time. The land that had been the center of her life, the place that had always felt like home, was now the battleground. The outlaws wanted it, but Ellie wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. The outlaws would never stop coming, but Ellie would keep fighting, keep protecting the farm that was hers. She would protect the land, the legacy of her family, and the future that she had worked so hard to build. She took a deep breath as the first rider appeared on the horizon. Her hand went to her revolver, and her heart steadied. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when everything would be decided. The fight for the farm had begun. The riders appeared on the horizon, dark figures silhouetted against the fading light of the day. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she stood beside her father, Jesse, and Luke, ready to face the storm that was about to descend upon them. The land they had fought for, the farm that had been passed down through generations, was on the line. Everything had come to this moment. Ellie's eyes flicked to her father, who was adjusting his rifle in his hands, his weathered face set with determination. He had seen enough violence in his lifetime, but this was different. This wasn't just another fight for survival. This was a fight for everything they had, for everything they would leave behind. She turned to Jesse, who was crouched low, rifle aimed in the direction of the approaching riders. His face was grim, his expression hard. He knew what was at stake, and he was ready to fight for it. "Are you ready?" Ellie whispered to him, her voice barely audible above the wind. Jesse's eyes met hers, his jaw clenched. "Always." Her father looked over at her. "We don't know how many are out there. We need to be ready for anything." Ellie nodded, her hand tightening on her revolver. "We'll make it through this. We can't let them take it." The riders drew closer, the rhythmic pounding of hooves shaking the ground beneath them. Ellie took one final breath, steadying herself for what was to come. She knew the moment the outlaws arrived, there would be no turning back. The lead rider raised his hand, signaling his men to slow down. They came to a stop just beyond the tree line, the sounds of the horses' breathing mixing with the low rustle of the wind. Ellie's eyes narrowed as she studied them. She recognized the leader, the man she had shot before, the one who had threatened her farm. He was still alive, though wounded, his eyes burning with hatred. "You've made a mistake, girl," the leader called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "This is your last chance. Hand over the map, and we'll let you live." Ellie's heart clenched, but she didn't flinch. She had heard this before. She wasn't backing down now. "You'll never take it from me," Ellie shouted back, her voice steady but filled with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. "This land is mine." The leader grinned, though there was something dark behind his eyes. "You really think you can stop us? You're just a girl and an old man. You don't stand a chance." Ellie's father raised his rifle, the barrel aimed directly at the leader. "I don't care what you think. We're not going anywhere." There was a brief silence, the tension thick in the air. The riders shifted, preparing for the charge, their hands resting on their weapons. Ellie's heart raced, but she kept her focus. This was the moment. She had to make it count. Suddenly, the leader jerked his horse forward, signaling the others to charge. The riders surged forward, but Ellie was already moving. She fired first, the shot ringing out in the still air. The leader's horse stumbled, its rider barely hanging on. Ellie didn't wait to see if he fell. She fired again, hitting one of the other riders who had tried to flank them. Her father fired his rifle, and another rider went down. The battle had begun. The outlaws were charging full force now, their guns drawn. Ellie and her father moved quickly, firing at the riders who came too close. Jesse was already taking shots from the other side, picking off riders with deadly precision. The barnyard was a flurry of movement, gunfire, horses galloping, and men shouting. Ellie dove behind a stack of crates, her heart pounding as she reloaded her revolver. She could hear the sounds of hooves all around her, the chaos of the fight intensifying. But she couldn't let fear take over. She had to stay focused. She had to protect her farm. The leader reappeared, riding his horse at full speed toward her. His eyes were filled with rage, and his gun was aimed at her. Ellie didn't hesitate. She fired, the bullet striking him in the shoulder. The man screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. He was determined to get the map, determined to take what wasn't his. But Ellie was quicker. She fired again, the bullet hitting him square in the chest. The leader tumbled off his horse and landed with a thud on the ground, unmoving. The remaining riders hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was clear that their leader was down, but they were still determined to finish the job. Ellie wasn't about to give them the chance. She and her father continued to fire, taking down one rider after another, but there were too many of them. They kept coming, trying to push forward, but Ellie knew they had to hold the line. If they could just take out enough of them, the rest would retreat. It was a battle of attrition, and Ellie wasn't sure how long they could hold out. Her revolver was nearly empty, and her father's rifle was starting to misfire, but she refused to back down. And then, just as Ellie thought the tide might be turning against them, the remaining riders began to pull back. One by one, they turned their horses and fled, leaving behind their fallen comrades. Ellie lowered her revolver, her heart still racing, but her hands steady. She glanced over at her father, who was already reloading his rifle. Jesse was crouched behind a pile of hay, scanning the area for any stragglers. "They're gone," Jesse said, his voice filled with disbelief. Ellie took a deep breath, the tension slowly starting to drain from her body. "For now, but we're not out of danger yet. They'll come back." Her father nodded, his face grim. "We've won this round, but the war's not over. We'll have to keep fighting." Ellie looked out over the farm, the sun beginning to set in the distance. The land that had been their home for so long was still theirs, for now. But she knew that the fight would never end. As long as there were men like the outlaws who had tried to take everything from them, they would always have to stand ready. And Ellie Hayes would always be ready to fight. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.